I'm currently studying overseas in Japan, visiting my relatives and all that jazz. They live 3 kilometers from the infamous forest where people end their life. I won't say the name because it's very bad for YouTube. To make sense of this story, I'd probably have to go back to 4 days earlier. My grandmother had been insisting on my visit for a long time because I'm in the country. At first, I wasn't too keen on it, but I thought, why not, and finally went. I had to wait for break though, so it took a while. Fast forward to actually arriving at her house, my grandmother had already contacted my mother about the matter of staying with her. It was fine. I'm going to tell you here and now that I'm a little bit skeptical about the existence of the paranormal. I've watched ghost adventures, ghost hunters, etc. I'm not all that religious either. I can never sit still in church, and the only time that I can remember myself going was when I was about 10 years old. My aunt told me that they would have food. She lied. I think that there might be a higher power, but I'm not sure. However, what I'm experiencing is convincing me otherwise about the existence of the paranormal. Now, let's get back to the original subject. Upon entering the house, I noticed immediately that A, it was extremely small, and B, there was a sudden feeling of extreme cold on my chest, like somebody took super cold ice and stuck it there. I asked my grandmother if they had an AC or fan going on, but she said no. I brushed it off as just my imagination. My grandmother's house has been around for God knows how long. It's old enough for people to actually see signs of wear in some places. The inside includes a modern 1 living room, 2 bathrooms, 2 bedrooms, plus a guest room, and a small backyard. Upstairs is the guest room that overlooks the backyard. One of the bathrooms is also upstairs. I mostly stayed inside the house and explored the backyard, which has an awesome Zen garden. I got to watch NHK with English subtitles. It's a Japanese TV channel. Google it. There were no incidents the first day other than the ice-cold feeling in the middle of my chest. I got the bedroom upstairs, which was above my grandparents' room, and it was a traditional room with the tatami mats and sliding door that separated the rooms into halves. The first half of the room is the one that you see when you walk through the door. There are shelves with manga, anime, music, sandals, and a small umbrella, etc. The second half, after you open the sliding door, is where the flat bed thingy on the floor is and the window straight ahead overlooking the garden. I stooped to put my possessions in the bottom shelf when I was in the first half of the room. When I stood back up, I felt a weird, heavy sensation in my chest, the kind that you get when you fall really fast towards something. I began to get dizzy and actually fell to my hands and knees. There were spots in my visions. As soon as it began, it stopped. I was about to get up while wondering what brought that on, when the same cold sensation from earlier hit my chest, but this time much harder. I also felt cold around my neck and couldn't breathe. I was terrified and wanted to get help, but couldn't get out a single word. This lasted for 30 seconds, but it felt much longer than that. As soon as I got my breath back, I rushed downstairs to tell my grandmother. She asked if I had any health problems prior to the incident. Of course I said no, because I'm a healthy person and I hardly ever get sick. She told me to sit down in the kitchen as she went to make tea. It tasted nasty. She told me that it would help me with me being ill. I was scared to go back upstairs, but she said I had probably been dehydrated and might have caught something. The rest of the night went without anything happening. The second day, nothing happened as well, but during the night, I thought I heard a woman talking near the window. It was a gentle voice, but there was a note of guilt in it. It sounded like she was apologizing and that the apology was directed at me. I could feel someone was there, but I thought I was just being paranoid, until that same cold feeling in my chest came when the voice and presence started. I put the blanket over my head and eventually fell asleep. This all led to now. I haven't been able to get much sleep. My grandmother thinks I'm sick. She even told me today that I look like a raccoon due to the dark circles under my eyes. The sensations are still happening at night. I was hesitant to share my story, but my friends encouraged me, so I'm giving it a shot. Recently, I've started to have a dream over and over again as well. It has a reoccurring pattern. The dream usually happens right after I can't stay awake any longer and fall asleep. I end up in a forest in broad daylight with thick fog. There's a dirt path that leads to a cliff. I'm probably on a mountain. I don't know because once I come out the forest, there's no detours, and there's a sheer drop 2.5 feet in front of me where the dirt path ends. I can't see anything in the distance. I can't go back the way I came. There's grass everywhere. That's when a falling woman comes out of nowhere and falls past the rocky edge of the cliff with her arms outstretched like she's trying to catch herself on said edge. She always misses. That was the first time, but now every time she comes falling down, an overwhelming urge to catch her takes me over. I run for the edge of the cliff, only for my hand to merely brush hers and miss. Sometimes I'll hear a splash of water way far down and everything becomes icy, just unbearably cold. I can't see the water, but when the splash is heard at times, it feels like my whole body is drenched in ice water and I can't breathe, like I'm drowning. I told my grandmother, and at first she didn't believe me, until last night. In my dream, I actually caught the falling woman. When I caught her wrist, she took a hold of mine. Excruciating pain was in my shoulder and wrist like I'd caught something heavy with one arm. She had a really tight grip. She looked to be 20 years old, and she had long brown hair, brown eyes, and she wore a dirty white dress that looked like it went through mud. Her skin was a bit tan but also pale. She had streaks of mud on her face. The woman said the same thing that the lady by the window said, "I'm sorry." To be honest, it scared me. I woke up today with a red hand mark around my wrist and my shoulder felt dislocated. My grandmother doesn't really know what to do, but she is researching. I can't sleep because I'm scared of the dream. I don't stay upstairs by myself. I completely avoid it during the day and I stay up as much as I can despite being so tired. I just don't want to go to sleep. I still get the same sensations in my chest and around my neck, but they're less intense, strangely gentle in some instances. I can still feel her presence. I don't know what she wants, and I need help. Any advice is appreciated. In 1990, I was a corporal in the Marine Corps, counting down the last 6 months of my tour of duty at Camp Butler on the island of Okinawa. Being an NCO, I managed to get my own room. Although made for 2 people, the room was small. When you entered, there was a wall locker, then a bunk on either side, and on the far wall was a desk, a small fridge, and an end table situated near a window. Hanging on the wall above the bunk on the left of the room was an old large mirror that held a strange-looking heavy wooden frame. I decided to take the bunk on the right. Having been recently promoted, most of my friends were of lesser rank than me, and I let them hide in my room whenever they needed to shirk any unwanted duty that came up. They never stayed long though. At first they would try to nap but complained of angry, violent dreams. Arguments would break out and even a few fistfights occurred over even the most of trivial things. People would enter the best of friends but leave angry, sad, or depressed. A few of us were sitting around talking when one of them, who had entered in the best of moods, suddenly became upset about something and jumped at me, getting me into a chokehold that took the other 2 with him to release me from. He later apologized and said that he had no idea what had come over him. Another time, my best friend was napping while I read a book when he suddenly sat up, looked off into space, and said, "I can't take this anymore," leaving abruptly with no explanation. He never stayed in that room again for more than a few minutes at a time. Feelings of dread, depression, and anger were only heightened by the noises that came from the room. I cannot count the number of times a sergeant who lived in the room next to me would come banging on my door, telling me to turn down my music or the TV I had. The problem was, I was a very quiet person, only listening to music on my headphones, and on the rare occasion, I would watch TV, but I kept it down at a low volume. Numerous times he would complain about loud parties I was having, only to find out that I was alone in my room writing letters or reading when he came in to see what was going on. During this time, I had use of an acoustic guitar and was writing my own songs. Since there was a lull in traffic out in the hall and most people were away for the weekend, I decided to record a song I had just written to see what I sounded like. I am a horrible singer, but wanted to hear how the words flowed with the song, so I turned on the recorder and very quietly strummed out my tune and sang along. I did this a few times until I had it the way I wanted, and then I listened to what I had. On the recording, I could hear the soft notes of the guitar and my horrible whispery voice. Suddenly, I began to hear people howling like dogs. I shut off the machine and rewound it again. Again, I could hear my feeble attempt at singing and then a chorus of people howling. It sounded as if they were making fun of my lack of musical talent. I was completely embarrassed and decided to wait until later to record my songs when I was completely alone. It did not hit me until later that the hallways and other rooms were empty at the time, and that upon listening again, the howling was coming from inside the room. The room had, to some degree, the same effect on me as it did everyone else, and it was easy to see that the mirror was causing it. When I had company, I noticed people would shy away from it. They would sit as far from it as possible and glance toward it now and then as if to make sure it hadn't moved. The mirror stood out, and although I used it, I didn't like to. I tried to avoid looking at it whenever I came or went, which was nearly impossible since it was so big. Once, after work was over for the day, but the sun was still shining bright, I was getting ready to go out. It was the weekend, and I was to meet some friends nearby. I had showered and dressed and was about to leave when I remembered something I had left on the desk. Retrieving it, I went toward the door, quickly checking myself in the mirror. I stopped and looked again. I still have a hard time believing what I saw. There, in front of my own reflection, was the clear image of a human arm. It was tan and slightly dirty looking, stretched out as if to shake someone's hand. There was no body or blood or anything, just an arm from the shoulder to the fingers. I am unsure as to how long I stood there staring at it. A full 30 seconds at least before it quickly faded away. It seemed as if I were in a trance the whole time, just looking at what should not be there. I couldn't move or even really comprehend what I was seeing. Once it was gone though, I came to my senses, feeling cold as if I were going to faint. I bolted for the door. Not sure what to make of this, I met my friends, feeling strange and confused, but said nothing. I needed more time to think about it. Soon after, the friend who had me in the chokehold was promoted and moved in with me. It took a week, but he finally said what everyone else had been thinking. He told me he couldn't stand the mirror and refused to stay another night in the room if it was not removed from the wall. He couldn't pinpoint one exact thing, but said that the mirror exuded a strong sense of, well, evil. Hearing this, I blurted out my own story about what I had seen, and we both agreed to do something. There really weren't any places to store the thing, and when we tried to toss it out, we were told by a superior that we couldn't dispose of government property without proper permission and had to put it back in the room. This guy would always keep on checking if we still had the mirror in our room. So eventually we took it off the wall, wrapped it in a heavy blanket, and placed it behind the refrigerator with the glass facing the wall. This sounds silly, but it worked. After that, there were no more bad dreams or fights to deal with, and things were noticeably better. It was as if someone had turned on a switch and all the darkness fell away. We had one more room inspection before leaving Okinawa and returning to the States, so we cleaned everything up, but forgot to place the mirror back on the wall. The officer giving the inspection was a friendly, easygoing lieutenant, and he only gave us one bad mark, the wrapped-up mirror behind our fridge. When he asked why it was like that, my roommate, much to my embarrassment, told him the whole story. The lieutenant listened, nodded, and then ordered us to unwrap the mirror. He looked at it, nodded again, crossed off the one bad mark he had written down, and said, "Wrap it back up. It looks better that way." We did just that, leaving it covered up for the next tenants to find. To make things a little bit more clear, I want to give a little background detail of the house that I lived in. The house was an older traditional style Japanese house. The kitchen and living room area was on the opposite sides of the house from where the bedrooms were. I also was the only one on the side of the house because my host mother was in the kitchen cooking supper and the rest of my host family were out working late. They had a cat and it was outside as well. My bedroom door was a fancy sliding door that was made of frosted glass, so I would see if someone walked by. Also, the ceiling in the hallway leading to the other side of the house from my bedroom is kind of low. It was a little bit before supper and I wanted to go and relax in my room. I laid down on my bed and started to reflect on how my day went. As I laid there, I got a strange feeling. It was a kind of excited, eerie feeling. I looked toward my door. I stared at it when, all of a sudden, a black, shadowy arm from the ceiling came down and knocked on the window of my door. I was flabbergasted. I went to my door cautiously and opened it. I looked up to the ceiling and found nothing there. At that moment, my host mother called me to supper. I ran to my host mother and told them what happened. She laughed at me and told me that I was just paranoid. Anyways, that night I had trouble falling asleep. Ever since I was young, I can see spirits, but this is the first time that it freaked me out that much. It was around 2 years ago when I was in Osaka. I shared a bedroom with my cousin. We were given a room at the corner of the corridor as it is the last room left in the entire hotel. Normally, when I would go in, I would knock on the door or press the doorbell to make an announcement of my arrival, as I believed that someone is living in another dimension in that room. After doing such routines, I opened the door and stepped into the room with my cousin. The room structure goes like this. On my left is the toilet with a cupboard on its right. After the cupboard, there is a luggage rack, followed by a TV, a dressing table with a mirror. In front of the TV, there's a bed, and beside the bed is a sofa. The first thing I did when I entered the room was to put the luggage on the luggage rack, and then put my shoe out in front of the rack. Then I left to use the bathroom. By the time I came out, the toilet was no longer in front of the rack. Instead, it was besides the rack. Seeing this, I ignored it, thinking that it is a normal prank by those quote-unquote friends. Thinking about that, I left the room and went shopping with my cousin and some other friends. That night, when we returned back to the hotel room, I went to take a bath, and after taking a bath, I thought of wearing the bathrobe that the hotel provided for us. However, upon opening the door of the cupboard, it gave me a big shock. A ghost was hanging on the hanger and asking what did I want. Seeing this, I stepped back in shock. This was the first time I have ever encountered something like this. Immediately, I closed the door and go to watch TV to give me some security. Soon enough, it was time for bed. My cousin left on a small light in the room and we both went to sleep. After some time, I heard a sizzling sound in my room, like someone touching a plastic bag. Hearing that, I turned on the light and looked around, but there was nobody there. By the time I turned my head to see the mirror, I was shocked. There was a lady with shoulder-length hair sitting in front of the mirror, combing her hair. I couldn't clearly make out her complexions, but I could tell that she was crying. Seeing that, I woke up my cousin, and we left the room, making our way to the lobby, hoping that we could change the room. But the receptionist refused to change it for us, so we had no choice but to stay in the lobby until the day came. In the morning, I asked one of them to accompany us to the room to get our luggage. When we arrived in the room, the phone rang. I picked up the phone, thinking that it is just the receptionist calling. Instead, it's a lady's voice, and it spoke, "Why didn't you return to the room last night? Don't you know that I'm waiting for you?" Hearing this, it sent chills down my spine. We quickly packed out our things and left the room without turning back. But before we left, I had a glance at the socket. To my surprise, the plug was not plugged in at all. meaning that last night, the TV was not supposed to be on at all. What were we watching last night? Recalling this, it made me feel that the lady is watching me somewhere and crying as well. Man, this story sounds fake. My first experience was when I went to Japan for a family visit over the summer. It's been a long time since I visited them. I was only 15 and that's when it happened. Before I went to Japan, some of my friends would tell me ghost stories. I thought that they were just teasing me, so I ignored them. When I arrived, it was going well. The first week of my stay in Japan was going very fine, but I felt as though a shadow was following me around. I kept on having this feeling like someone had been watching me for a while. One time I woke up in the middle of the night and was still sleepy. I don't even know why I decided to get up, but when I looked over to my shadow, I found another shadow beside my shadow. I quickly turned around, but nobody was there. I was freaked out, so I went to talk with my mom and dad, but they wouldn't listen to me. I went back to sleep, but felt a warm hand touch my forehead. I was scared, so I just pulled up the blanket over my head and closed my eyes tight. The next morning, I talked to my grandma and told her about it. She told me that it must have been her late daughter's dead son who died at age 17 of a fever a long time ago. She told me not to be scared because he wouldn't do anything to harm me. Even if she said not to be scared, I was still scared. Ever since I told my grandma about it, she would tell me stories about the time when he was still alive and that he was a nice man. For some time, a few weird things happened, but I just ignored them or forced myself to sleep. On our leave, we waved goodbye to my grandma and others. When we got back to the car, I stared at the house from the corner of my eye. This was when I saw a man by the window waving by. I turned around to look, but nobody was there. I then noticed that the man was from the room that I was staying in. I was scared, but I'm glad that we left because I don't know what might have happened if I stayed there any longer. The year was 1978, and I was 15 years old. My best friend had returned to Japan after spending a year attending our junior high in the States, while her father was a visiting professor at the local university. I missed her terribly after she had gone and was able to persuade my grandfather to send me to Japan to visit her during that coming summer. I arrived on a July evening, completely exhausted, of course, yet terribly excited. My friend and her mother showed me to my room, which was the only traditional Japanese room in the home, one tatami matting and sliding doors. This is a feature common to fairly affluent homes in Japan, modern construction and conveniences for the majority of the house, with one traditionally Japanese room. I recall that when her mother opened the corner closet to retrieve the futon mats that would be my bed, a cold chill emanated from it. I thought nothing of it. Of course, an enclosed space would be less affected by the ambient temperature of a room. I slept very soundly that first night. The following night after I retired, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house as it was winding down for the evening. I heard light switches click off and the bedroom doors upstairs closing. I was imagining what new adventures we might have tomorrow. I then began to hear a faint laughter. It seemed to be coming from perhaps the neighboring house. Perhaps there was a little get-together over there. Then the laughter became louder. Then the laughter became closer. Now the laughter was menacing. It was a decidedly evil man's laughter, which now closed in around my ears, growing louder and louder. Something was telling me to get up and go upstairs to get my friend. I was wide awake. I tried to do just that, only to find out that I couldn't move, not a single muscle. My instinct and unusual spiritual training for a young person kicked in. I had practiced yoga since I was a young child, and just before leaving, my yoga instructor had mentioned something about an East Indian holy man named Ramana. The mere mention of his name dispelled negative energies. I tried to say his name out loud. I was ready to try anything. To my horror, I discovered that I could not also speak. Fear froze me in my place, and my instincts told me what I had to do in the midst of this terror is to relax. I began to imagine myself floating through a starry night sky. A calm in the midst of the storm around me came over me. I tried to speak the name of the holy man again, and this time I was able to mouth the word. Still, no sound came out. As I did so, it was as if a switch had been turned off. The evil laughter, which had become deafening about my ears, stopped. I was able to move and considered running upstairs to my friend, yet somehow I knew that I was safe now, so I thought that I would not wake her. The following day, a number of my friends' friends came for a welcoming tea. I told the story of what happened to me, and yes, they told me that it was called a Kanashibari. This means something like wrapped in bandages. It was a common thing which occurred in Japan, where some nearby spirits or another who happens to be roaming about decides to have a bit of fun with a resting human. They proceeded to tell me other tales of spirits, both playful and malevolent, who specialized in turning children around in their beds so that their head would be where their feet were when they woke up. They were not surprised in the least by my experience and had no trouble believing that I had indeed been awake and that this was no dream. The entity was likely a demonic one, judging from my description. I imagined that anyone who had heard the laughter would also concur. The direction from whence the laughter had originated, I realized, had been the bedding closet which had exhibited the chilly draft the night before. I took from that experience the notion that calm in the presence of malevolent entities is a powerful strategy. Indeed, my later studies of martial arts would serve to underscore that conclusion. Don't strike when you are angry. You might miss. In May of 2008, I went to the island of Saipan. Saipan is near Guam in Japan. Before World War II, Saipan belonged to the Japanese. The Japanese had an airport there that had military buildings and bomb shelters. During World War II, the US military fought for the island of Saipan and took it away from the Japanese. The bomb shelters are well built and still standing today. The new airport is built nearby. On a beautiful sunny day, I was exploring a bomb shelter. I was alone and happy and having a nice relaxing time. Birds and insects were making their usual tone, and it was really peaceful. I went into a small door in the middle of a bomb shelter and stood just inside the door. I looked at the two rooms for people on the left and right side of the door. The two rooms were empty, except for some crumbled concrete, litter, and some rusted metal sticking out from the walls. The light in the bomb shelter was pretty bright since it was really sunny outside. As I was standing there, right inside the doorway, quietly looking around, the light suddenly started to get really dim inside of the bomb shelter, and I heard a rushing sound in my ears. The rushing sound was like if you put coffee cups over your ears, but much louder. Then, a shadow rushed right by me and sat down on the bench seat that was now mounted on the formerly rusted metal sticking out from the wall. Several more shadows rushed by me and sat on the bench seats. One shadow would rush to the left room and the next would rush into the right room. The shadows were rushing about every second, and if they had both gone the same direction, they would have collided. It looked like they had practiced drills of rushing into the bomb shelter quite before. I could see the shadows. They looked like they were made out of gray cigarette smoke. I could see their heads and bodies, but not their hands or feet. I saw that they were thin Japanese soldiers. They looked like they were about 5 feet tall and weighed about 100 pounds or less. Their uniforms were tidy and well maintained, but the cloth looked like it was getting thin and worn out. I noticed that they all had their hats still on too. Nobody lost one during the rush. As each soldier rushed to the bench, he scooted over and made as much room for the next guy as he could. All the soldiers stared at the door and hoped more soldiers were coming. As each shadow rushed by, I realized there was not enough room in the doorway and they were actually going through me to get inside the bomb shelter. I could feel them pass right through me. It felt the same as if I was holding my breath and releasing it as each shadow passed by. They were running by at about one shadow per second. I may have been actually holding my breath as each shadow passed by, and that's what I felt, not the shadows at all. I will never really know about the exact details. Then, I could hear a loud rumble approaching in the distance and a few explosions. I could see the soldiers were still looking at the open door and waiting for the rest of their comrades. There were a few more empty spaces on the benches. I turned to look at the door too and was surprised by the really bright light from the sunny day outside. The noise stopped at the moment. I turned back to look at the soldiers, and the bomb shelter was bright again, and all the shadow soldiers were gone. I'm glad this didn't just happen to me by myself, but was also experienced by my Japanese friend at the time. It was amazing and quite a shock to our systems. I had wanted to visit Takashima Castle on the shores of Lake Suwa in Nagano Prefecture and finally drove there in late autumn of 2006. After getting lost on the way, my friend and I arrived at the small park with a dungeon building and moat at around 6:30 p.m. It was dark, and the main building, now a museum reconstructed in the 1960s, was closed and locked up. I was a bit disappointed that I couldn't enter and check out the museum, but still happy to be there. I began fooling around, first climbing up the castle wall a little bit, ninja style, then proceeded up the stone flight of stairs to the locked doors of the main keep. I jokingly knocked on the door and gave the handle a tug. Yeah, it was locked. I went to get my keys out of my pocket once again, jokingly, and as I did, my friend took off her high-heel boots and ran off back down the stairs. "Did you hear that?" she yelled. I remember hearing some kind of sound from behind the door, but nothing that registered. I gingerly went to the bottom of the stairs and asked what was wrong. Then, from the top of the stairs, coming from inside the keep, a man's laughter rang out. We froze and looked at each other, not speaking, and then looked back up at the door. It sounded like the voice of a 40-ish-year-old Japanese man. Uh-oh, I thought, as I waited for a security guy or groundskeeper to come out and tell me off, but all we heard was just laughter. I thought it was a bit odd. 30 seconds seemed to pass by, and we gazed up to the door when suddenly, from very close, no more than 3 meters in front of me, from thin air on the stairs again, loudly, we heard the same laughter. Adrenaline kicked in and I grabbed my friend and said, "Run! Run!" We ran on jelly legs in the opposite direction, my friend almost in tears from fright. I apologized out loud in a shaky voice as we passed through a gate over the moat bridge. Then, as we stopped for a breath once more, seemingly from atop the window keep, another burst of maniacal laughter. I was glad he or whoever it was didn't follow us, but my friend was pretty dang scared and so was I. We got to the back of the car and drove off with one memory we will never forget. As for me, I had more respect for old sites of bloody and violent history. When I was a senior high school student in Japan, where I was born and lived in my entire life, I was in the orchestra section. The school itself looks recently renovated. One day, after a whole day of studies, I went to the orchestra section's training room, and I needed to go to the toilet. The toilet was on the other side of a corridor, and the boys' was on the inner side of the side corridor. A few seconds later, I went to the toilet and did my business there, in a standing-type bathroom. And then I left the door of the entrance of the boys' toilet opened. When I was doing my business, I noticed a human-form shadow going even deeper up the side corridor. At first, I thought that, looks like somebody passed the entrance. But later on, I realized about 2 things that explains that it was impossible what the shadow did. Then I began to have a cold sweat on the beginning of a warm autumn. I went out of the toilet and double-checked. There was no more space to go deeper on the other side of the corridor. This was because it has a wall-sized window, and one more thing, the place was on the 5th floor. I already heard about rumors that the school was a sales-flamed hospital before. Some say that they saw the spirit of a really creepy ghost behind a professor. The student who saw the spirit was on the orchestra section too, so I believed in them. On top of that, there's rumors that somebody took their life inside of the school. I'm in Brazil now, studying as a college student, but even now, to this day, I don't know if those rumors are true. Okay, moral of the story is don't use those toilets that you have to poop standing up, or you gotta squat. Back in July of the year 2010, I had a trip to Okinawa, located south of Japan. To be remembered, Okinawa is one of the places in Japan which had suffered the consequences of World War II, being attacked by the US military. Because of that, many people have died, including Japanese civilians, Japanese military, and even the US military. Since I already studied about Okinawa's story, I had a strange feeling that something spiritual will happen there before I visited Okinawa. On top of that, Okinawa is one of the places that has a US military base. I believe that this occurred on the second day of the trip. We were guided by a local person to a man-made cave called Gama, which used to be a place of refuge for the local people in case of an aerial bombing run. Because of the low hygiene, many people have died there as well. Children, women, and the elderly, or even the sick and injured. Not only this, but during that time, even the Japanese military said to civilians, "When the US soldiers come to you, take your life before they kill you all. Die for glory, die for Japan." The cave itself was slippery because of the rain and the dark. It was really dark in there, like pitch black. Because of that, we had to move with hand lights. While we were advancing, we had a moment to turn off the light to see how dark it was. The cave was also chilly rather than to be cold. A few seconds later, I heard a woman's crying voice from inside the cave, but I've noticed that it wasn't the voices of the girls with us. There were only 2 girls with us at the time. Then I started to think to myself, this is not a living person's voice. Later, we went out of the cave, and in order to confirm, I asked the girls if one of them had cried, but the answer was, none of us cried there. I asked the boys too, but they also had the same answer. I wonder what the crying woman's spirit wanted to tell me, or to us. It was during the summer of 2012, a good time for walking or biking in Japan, because during the winter you just can't get out of the house, especially when the snow is thick, around 5 meters on our place. I'm working at a construction company not too far from my apartment. If you drive to it, it's about 5 to 7 minutes, but because it's the summer, I use my mountain bike, so it takes me about 20 to 30 minutes. I always take the road where most people use, less danger, and I can clearly see the road. Most of the time, I go home with my coworker Kenji because his girlfriend was residing in the next building near to my apartment. One time when I was with him, he suggested that we take a shortcut and use the route that will cross the river of Kaminokawa. There's not much light there because the light post was not close to each other, but there's a part of it where you travel about 5 minutes and the only light is the moonlight to guide you on your path. This path would reduce our 30 minutes of biking to 20 minutes because of that shortcut. One time, Kenji got sick and had to take leave for 2 weeks. Because I wasn't with him, I used the normal path that I always took, the one that took 30 minutes. But suddenly, my girlfriend from Tokyo messaged me that she'll be staying in my apartment for a week, which means that for a week, I will have to hurry home so I could see how she was doing. So for the whole week, I took that shortcut, the one that takes 5 minutes where the moonlight is the only light guiding your way. On the second day of using the shortcut, I saw a person dressed in all white. It was a lady. She had long hair that reached her waist and she was facing the river. The lady was sitting on a bench with a light post near to the dark spot of the road. Because I was in a hurry, I didn't really give much attention to her. The next day, I saw her again around 8 p.m. This time, she's standing on the railings of the river, which was why I can't help but think, what is a girl doing out here alone? I didn't know her, and Japan has a really low crime rate, so that's why I was comfortable that she's safe and decided not to go near her. On the third day, I no longer saw her anymore on the bench. Instead, I saw her standing in the middle of the dark spot of the road, standing on the railings and facing the river. Because it's so dark there, that's when I decided to come ask her what she was doing and also try to warn her. Around 10 meters away, I shouted hello to her. It seemed like she didn't hear me, so I came closer, but around 2 meters, I noticed that she was not on the roadside of the railings, she's on the other side. That's why I can't help but to look where she was standing. This was when I noticed that she wasn't standing on anything. Instead, she was floating on the river and her hair was moving, even though there was not much wind at the time. At that point, my whole body, including the hair from my wrist to the back of my neck and my head, all stood up. I quickly turned back without knowing what was happening, my body automatically responding to what I was visualizing at that moment. I couldn't focus on pedaling my bike, and that's why I decided to push it while running. While running, I took a glimpse back at her and saw her. She was beginning to turn around to look at me. It was so dark and the next light post was around 40 meters away, I ran as far as I could without looking back. The light post got closer, but to me, it still seemed like it was 100 miles away. Luckily, I saw a car coming towards me, and its headlight illuminated the darkness out of the road, and I didn't see the girl anymore. I told the story to Kenji, and we decided to not take that road ever again. Only lately, we figured out that that spot is where a girl around 17 years old was hit and ran over by a car.